Welcome to English Mirror. Today, we analyze British history in the 1970s. In the 21st century, historians have increasingly portrayed the 1970s as a pivot of change in world history, focusing especially on the economic upheavals that followed the end of the post-war economic boom. Let's look into it. After the dynamic optimism of the 60s, the 70s proved to be a decade of disillusionment. The idealistic belief of millions of young people that they could change the world crumbled into cynicism and bitterness. From their bitter disillusionment arose a wave of terrorism. The 70s ushered in a mood of weary disenchantment. The Wilson era came to an end. A conservative government under Edward Heath was elected in 1970. In the late 60s, people had had enough of radical changes and were longing for a more conservative approach. Unfortunately, Heath, instead of adopting a conservative attitude, attempted to push Britain into a more efficient future. He introduced further changes in politics and technology that were characteristic of the over-optimistic thinking of the 60s. For a while, the economy seemed unreal. There was a sharp increase in real estate prices, leading to a great concentration of city development. Inflation rates became alarming. The trade unions were becoming very aggressive and were at odds with the conservative government over its Industrial Relations Act. The prices of essential commodities shot up, and there began a period of disorder. Heath tried his best to meet the crisis, but his government collapsed in 1974. When Harold Wilson returned as the next Prime Minister, it was a chaotic period of industrial unrest, power cuts, and food shortages. Wage demands, high spending by the government, inflation, and public borrowing ruined the country. One could clearly discern the Labour Party's decisive turn to the left. Shipbuilding and the aircraft industries were nationalised. The new government gave in to the unions on everything in the first 18 months. From raised wages to their demands for unprecedented privileges. The unions, drunk with power, could be seen controlling a wide range of government policies. This was a time when Jack Jones, the leader of the largest union, the Transport and General Workers Union, was widely described as the second most powerful man in the country. In 1975, when the country was on the very brink of a financial crisis, Wilson resigned. Over the next couple of years, the Conservatives under Mrs. Margaret Thatcher won a long series of by-elections, toppling the huge Labour majorities. With the increasing power of the Conservatives, there was a steady swing back to the right. Between 1975 and 1976, both of Britain's major political parties had chosen new leaders. James Callaghan replaced Harold Wilson as the leader of the Labour Party, and Margaret Thatcher took over from Edward Heath. Callaghan's modus operandi was very different from that of his predecessor Wilson. He practiced a more conservative approach. As a result, by 1979, people felt that conservative politics might as well be carried out not by Labour but by the Conservatives themselves. In 1979, the Conservative Party won, and Margaret Thatcher became the first woman Prime Minister of England. Thatcher's conservatism was very different from that of Heath. With the end of the 70s, the British people began to feel that a revival of conservative attitudes was essential. They were quite fed up with the heady days of the Wilson government in the mid-70s when trade unions were having a field day. Various writers and politicians who were earlier leftists, now warned the people that the power of the unions, if unchecked, would eventually change the country into a Marxist totalitarian state. The vision of a just, equal, and compassionate society based on socialism turned sour. The 20th century dream of a social and political utopia turned into a nightmare as the darker side of socialism became visible. In the 70s, it was clearly seen how cruelly the socialist dream could betray humanitarianism. Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, published between 1974 and 1978, revealed to the world the horrifying experience of Russia under socialist totalitarianism. In this climate, Thatcher's new conservatism was irresistible. The youth revolution had reached its climax in the 60s. The youth of the previous decade had worked themselves to a hysterical pitch by shaking, deafening, blinding, and drugging themselves. There was almost nowhere further to go and no more traditions to break. One of the many reasons why the 70s had such an air of a hangover was that a psychological climax had been reached and could never be achieved again. Another aspect of the 70s was the increasing interest in the religions of the East. Western materialism found solace at the feet of the gurus of the East. Even the Beatles practiced transcendental meditation. This inclination towards Eastern mysticism reflected the growing disillusionment of the West with its own values. The most disturbing development of the decade was the spread of terrorism internationally. Hijackings, kidnappings, and bombings were on the increase. In England, the Irish Republican Army (IRA) intensified its nationalistic campaign through a series of terrorist activities. Several people were wounded when 2 car bombs exploded in central London. The IRA was responsible for the disaster. Another explosion caused by the IRA destroyed parts of the 800-year-old Westminster Hall and the Tower of London. There were several other cases of IRA-backed terrorist activities in the 70s. In fact, Earl Mountbatten, Queen Elizabeth II's cousin, was killed by an IRA bomb. Giant strides were being taken in the world of science. For example, computers and cheap calculators were flooding the market. History was created in the world of medical science when the world's first test tube baby was born in England in 1978. However, the climax of technological advancement had been reached when man first landed on the moon. Never again in human experience could there be such a moment. Nothing could startle or excite people to that degree again. Sometime during the 70s, people began to take another look at the negative effects of science and technology. It was the 70s which, for the first time in history, received the earliest warnings that the Earth's supplies of energy and natural resources were getting depleted. The most outstanding feature of the 70s was that, for the first time, mankind began to depend so much on oil that oil consumption far outbalanced oil production. By the end of the decade, the global energy crisis was a harsh reality. Metals were also slowly disappearing. Gradually, it became obvious to people that the technological explosion would ultimately lead the world into a nightmare. In the USA, people were getting disillusioned with the Vietnam War. The ending of the war highlighted America's failure in keeping Southeast Asia from falling under communist domination. The withdrawal of American troops from Vietnam was a shameful retreat. Soon after, Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, was occupied by the communists, and several Vietnamese began to flee the country. A worldwide refugee problem was created as a result of this. The USA had to suffer further loss of face through the Watergate scandal and the subsequent resignation of President Richard Nixon. This disillusionment went very deep. Modernism exhausted itself. It had experimented with form, structure, and tonality till there was no structure left to topple. Its place was taken by postmodernism, which was essentially a literature of irrealism. Orthodox literature claimed that every work of art should have a meaning and simplify the complexity of life. Modernism rejected the stale modes of meaning making but recognized the need to find meaning. Postmodernism celebrated the absence of meaning and reflected man's sense of disorder. The postmodernist novel dislocated meaning for its own sake and did not lead the reader towards comprehension. The play of words upon words resulted in a semantic farce aimed at reflecting man's meaninglessness. John Barth, Susan Sontag, and John Fowles are a few of the postmodernist novelists who wrote during this period. Some of the writers who had begun their careers in the modern period continued to write in the 70s. Graham Greene wrote several books which had the Cold War as their backdrop. P.G. Wodehouse continued to be popular and was widely read. Doris Lessing and Irish Murdoch were some of the prominent women writers of the period. American novels which drew public attention in the 70s were Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow, Saul Bellows' Humboldt, Gift, William Styron's Sophie's Choice, and Alex Haley's Roots. The memorable films of the 70s were Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather, Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and the dance drama film Saturday Night Fever. The 70s was essentially a decade of disillusionment. Of course, there had been several benefits due to the progress of technology, such as hot baths, color television, jet travel, and assorted medical marvels. Nevertheless, people began to discern that these were just short-lived luxuries. There was a hankering after a lost simplicity and innocence. To sum up in the words of Christopher Booker, never before in history had there been an age so distrustful of the present, so fearful of the future, so enamored of the past. Thank you for watching this video.